Welcome to Greece, an often forgotten theater of World War II, which threatens to drift into the background once again as the seismic political maneuvering between East and West realigns the balance of power in Europe. But things here are not stable. Even before World War II ends, the dominoes have started falling. The result? Peace on the European continent is over before it's even begun. I'm Indy Neidell. Welcome to Season 1 of TimeGhost's Cold War coverage in our series War to War, where we follow the wars that wouldn't end within a Cold World War. The beginning of the digital age, the atomic age, and the space age, when we began to replicate our minds electronically, gained the power to end our very existence as a species, and discovered that we truly can reach for the stars. Okay, to understand the situation in Greece, we need to take a quick trip to the recent past. It's hard to think of Greece as anything except a politically literate and conscious nation, thinking back to the classical era and all. The same is certainly true of Greece in the early 20th century, and one question in particular dominated the political sphere: republic or monarchy? The politics of the time were a tug-of-war between the Venizelist movement and its founder Eleftherios Venizelos and those who opposed them and favored the status quo. Venizelism generally advocated for a kind of liberal nationalist outlook and the restoration of some former territories of the Ottoman Empire. It's pretty easy to characterize the movement as Republican and anti-monarchist, and a large proportion of Venizelos politicians were exactly that. But overall, the nuances there are super complex. Too complex to dig into now, anyway. But the point is that Venizelism and its opposition were the battle lines in Greek politics throughout the interwar years. Political discussion of any kind in the nation grew increasingly polarized and vitriolic, and discussion about the serious economic issues which genuinely threatened the population, like land reform and social security, more or less didn't happen. The population became disillusioned with the political system as a result, as their representatives fixated on a handful of macro issues. Short-sightedness like this, I imagine, will cease to be a thing in the future. The Greek Communist Party, which sought to offer a genuine alternative to the Venizelos discussion, found their own momentum curtailed by interference from their ideological master, the Soviet Union. In an effort to appease the Bulgarian communists, the Soviets decided in favor of establishing an independent Macedonian and Thracian state, separate from Greece. They demanded that the Greek Communist Party, the KKE, fall in line with their decision, and so the KKE did in 1924. As a legal political party in Greece, this was an utter nightmare for the communists, who now somehow had to defend their choice in public forums. In the intensely nationalistic atmosphere within Greece in the 1920s, the KKE's political position on the Macedonian issue caused a sharp downturn in the party's electoral prospects and popular support, which reached a nadir of 1.41% in the 1928 general election. This was the price that Greek communists paid to belong to the International Communist Brotherhood. It would prove to be a millstone around the neck of every Greek communist and deny the party mass support. Greece itself had, in fact, been a republic since 1924, after rising Republican sentiment and a military coup forced King George II into exile. This didn't last that long, though, and monarchist agitation in 1935, followed by a rigged plebiscite, set the stage for George's return in November. It really shows just how much of a tug-of-war Greek politics was at this time. With the Greek political system mostly paralyzed and only growing more dichotomized, the stage is set for the events of 1936. The elections of January 36 made for grim reading for both sides. 143 seats for the royalists and 141 for the Republicans. The communists, again the KKE, recovered from their unpopularity somewhat and were able to secure 15 seats. Now, they're playing the role of kingmaker, maybe even literally so. They can prop up either party and force all kinds of concessions in exchange for their support. Or at least, that was what they thought would happen. George II and the Greek High Command can clearly see the pathway to another military coup, potentially another long exile, or worse, a communist revolution. They act quickly, appointing the monarchist general Ioannis Metaxas as Minister of War. But then Prime Minister Konstantin Demirtas dies suddenly on April 13th. Metaxas, whose feet have barely hit the floor as Minister of War, is chosen to succeed him. But civil disobedience and disorder continue to ramp up. Labor strikes are planned and go ahead, and there appears to be no end to the chaos in sight. So on August 4th, George II takes the extraordinary step of suspending the Constitution, instituting martial law, and allowing Ioannis Metaxas to rule by decree. For many, this is the low point in Greece's modern existence. The new regime led by Metaxas is harsh and authoritarian, empowering the police to oppress the regime's political opponents, clamping down on any dissent, and increasing the power of the state in domestic life. In a way, the rhetoric and actions of his government mimic fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, but without an obvious aggressive foreign policy and with continued support for the monarch. It also lacks the will to push things further, as Hitler and Mussolini have, and exists as a backward-looking, ultra-conservative government which prioritizes order and stability above all else. None of the underlying issues are resolved, merely frozen in time and space. So anger continues to build, anger which will inevitably be unleashed when those issues begin to thaw. For the communists, it is perhaps the moment when armed revolt became inevitable, since the Republican left blamed the Metaxas dictatorship not only on the king who had given it his endorsement, but on the principal bourgeois parties which had done little to prevent its establishment. Indeed, for the communists and their sympathizers, the Metaxas regime symbolized the bankruptcy of the country's entire political system. The Italian and then German invasions of Greece in 1940 and 1941 set the ball rolling once more. The emergence of the National Liberation Movement, EAM, and its armed wing, the National People's Liberation Movement, ELAS, E-L-A-S, at first come as organizations capable of resisting the Axis occupation, with members from all different political backgrounds. Even so, EAM and ELAS are fundamentally communist organizations in their structure and are carefully controlled by members of the KKE. The party leadership was anxious not to substantiate rumors that ELAS was a communist army, which would have alienated the people, who were not yet aware of who the genuine patriots were. In March 1944, the figure of the politicos was abandoned at lower echelons, and ELAS moved towards a two-man command structure. By this time, EAM had consolidated its grip on daily life in free Greece, leaving ELAS to concentrate on military duties. But communist influence remained as strong as ever. As in many other nations in World War II, the communists emerge as the largest and strongest resistance movement in Greece, although they spend their time fighting other Greek partisans and even the allies late in the war. We cover Greece throughout this period in the regular series of our World War II channel, especially in December 1944 and January 1945, and also in the War Against Humanity series. So I won't go over it again here, and you really should go and check all that out. The Greek government, which ultimately returns to govern the nation after the German withdrawal, is a government of national unity headed by Georgios Papandreou. At first, anyhow, and King George II is content to temporarily remain out of the country until a plebiscite on his return is held. It is worth noting that the British, who had agreed with Stalin that Greece should fall into the UK's sphere of influence back in 1944, strongly support the return of the monarchy and work towards this goal. This is eventually accomplished in September 1946, when George II formally retakes the throne, ending his second exile. But what about actually ending the fighting in Greece? Well, nobody is under any illusion that things are not tense. Papandreou's government of national unity and its British backers push for an agreement to be made with EAM and ELAS for disarmament. They're well aware of how effectively they fought the Germans for years, and the prospect of trying to clear them out of their mountainous strongholds, potentially while volunteers and equipment trickles in from the new Stalinist states to the north, is not a particularly appetizing one. A formal agreement comes at Varkiza, a small resort near Athens, on February 12, 1945. The document is signed by Greek Foreign Minister Ioannis Sofianopoulos on the government side and by the de facto head of EAM and ELAS, Georgios Tsiantos, on the communist side. Some of the main terms of the agreement include complete demobilization and disarmament of Elas forces, and the communists must agree to turn over 41,000 rifles, over 2,000 machine guns, as well as mortars and artillery pieces. Civil liberties and the right to form trade unions are to be guaranteed. Hostages and prisoners are to be freed, and amnesty will be granted to Elas members who committed crimes in defense of the country. So this does not extend to crimes provably committed for personal reasons. A new regular army is also to be formed, which Elas generals and soldiers would be allowed to join. In theory, this represents an effort to blend communist partisans back into Greek society and hopefully put the prospect of civil war to bed for good. The KKE looks forward to a new dawn as a serious political party in Greece, no longer rendered a sideshow by Republican versus monarchy debates or pushed underground by dictators. But that is not to be, because as the communists surrender their arms, what will come to be known as the White Terror sweeps the nation. Ultra-right-wing gangs swarm across the country, attacking and repressing former left-wing partisans and anyone expressing sympathies with Elas or Eam. This is by nature part ideological warfare and part historical grievances. Crimes committed by the partisans against Greeks during the war provide the perfect pretext to punish them, and justice is dispensed not only by the gangs, but by government institutions too. With some creative interpretation of the terms of the Varkiza agreement, police and courts begin to arrest and charge former Elas members with moral responsibility for crimes committed. In other words, the promise of amnesty means precisely nothing. Judges choose to sentence former partisans for crimes committed by Elas at large on the basis that simply being a member of or sympathizer to the movement is enough to prove some kind of collective guilt. So thousands of them get arrested and charged, guilty or innocent. Seriously, so many of them that the courts cannot even keep up. Some sit languishing in cells well past the 6-month statutory limit and still do not see the inside of a courtroom. So if you are a former partisan, what do you do now? Well, fight back, lash out, give back what you're getting, the only way you know how. It left the adherents of Eam Elas and the KKE with little choice except to fight or face heavy-handed persecution for an indefinite period of time at the hands of former collaborators. The scale of retaliation by ultra-right-wing gangs against the partisans of the left was widespread and remained unchecked, especially outside of Athens and the other major urban centers. The authorities could not or would not intervene in thousands of situations where fanatics of both political extremes indulged in beatings, looting, rape, and murder. Many fight back in this way, and the Greek nation once again descends into civil disobedience and violence. The British continue to insist on democratic elections and a return to a peaceful political process, assuming this right-wing retaliation to be just a temporary rush of emotion. But as the level of violence and intimidation continues exploding across the nation, how fair can any election be? For the communists, this only confirms their fears, that the British tacitly support what by now is essentially a purge. Those that can leave do so and head for the mountains, where the recently demobilized National Popular Liberation Army is rumbling back to life. In fact, the communists are not completely helpless here. Not all of their arms and ammunition had been surrendered when the Varkiza agreement was signed, and squirreled away up in the mountains, they have enough gear to arm an estimated 30,000 people. Leftover preserved food still remains from their guerrilla days, and maybe they can count on shipments from their communist neighbors to the north, too. Ex-Elas generals begin to gather their old comrades and head north to rejoin. Partisans who had originally not been communists but have faced persecution by the ultra-right for their ties to them inevitably also get pushed further left and add their own anger to the ticking time bomb. In December 1945, a meeting takes place in Bulgaria between leading members of the KKE and representatives of the Yugoslav and Bulgarian chiefs of staff. Aid, both arms and food, is promised by the Bulgarians and Yugoslavians. The decision of the Communist Party to accept local armed groups and start a form of insurgency is taken in mid-February 1946. On the 21st, they decide to abstain from the coming elections as they would be held in conditions of terror and fraud. More importantly, KKE begins to consider for the first time an actual armed insurrection as a means of self-protection and political pressure. Yugoslavia, the Soviet Union, and the rest of the Eastern Bloc countries urged KKE to reconsider and participate in the elections, but in vain. The first Greek post-war election takes place March 31st, 1946. Unsurprisingly, it is a resounding win for the royalists, represented by a coalition of right-wing parties under the banner of the United Alignment of Nationalists, who take well over 50% of the votes. The communists, however, have already begun to move. The night before the election takes place, 33 communist soldiers head from the mountains into the small town of Litochoro on the eastern slopes of Mount Olympus and attack it. The police station and multiple other buildings are set ablaze, and 6 government soldiers, a gendarme, and 2 civilians are killed in the fighting. The motive for this attack is not all that clear, because it's not really accompanied by a bigger offensive by organized communist forces. One explanation is that the perpetrators believe that similar attacks are taking place all across the nation, and that their actions are supposed to be part of a wider uprising. Another is that this is meant to be a show of intent, a warning to whatever new government is elected the following day that they are armed and prepared. Whatever the case, though, that warning is not heeded. On the contrary, the British police mission, trying to maintain order in post-war Greece, reports that violent attacks and murders skyrocketed between the end of 1945 to the middle of 1946. No fewer than 30 village chiefs abandon their homes and flee to British troops for protection, and 28 gendarmes are killed by left-wing attacks, mostly in Macedonia and northern Thessaly. The retreat of gendarmes and government officials from these regions increases communist control there and accelerates what has now become an inevitability, yet another round of the Greek Civil War. In October, leaders of these local groups agree to form a unified force, which is called the Democratic Army of Greece in December 1946. This new Democratic Army musters its forces in the mountains, and the government's Hellenic army prepares itself for the fight. A lot could be about to happen in a very short time period. The British likely won't sit idly by while a proper armed conflict envelops the region, nor will Yugoslavia and Bulgaria, whose aid has already been promised. What about the Americans? Hell, what about the Soviets? Over 30 years of unresolved political conflict is about to come to a head in these next months or even years. What's to come next? Where will the hammer fall? Which other powers will get sucked into the conflict? Could Greece be the first major flashpoint, the first major crisis which shakes the delicate peace that exists between East and West? Will the fighting here destabilize the Balkans as a whole? There's only one way to find out. Stay tuned. It is a pleasure to be bringing this history to you, and something tells me there is a whole lot more to come. So if you like what we're doing, and we know you like what we're doing, then join the TimeGhost Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. It is the army which gives us everything we need to keep making our content week after week after week after week. Seriously, we couldn't do this without you guys. And don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Excelsior!